What was it like buying video games in the UK in the 80s? Hello Cave Dwellers, welcome to our recreated retro computer shop. We're going to ignore this side of the shop today and we're focusing on this, the 8-bit era, all of these cassette tapes. And for anyone in the UK in the 80s, this would be a very familiar sight. If you're outside of the UK, it might be a little bit exotic to see some of the systems like the Amstrad CPC and the ZX Spectrum with games in such volumes. We spend a lot of time on this channel chasing exotic and unusual tech stories, and it struck me that I'm sat on this, which while very familiar to me, might be exotic and unusual in your part of the world. So why don't we just pull some tapes off of the shelves and have a look at them and get a flavour for what was available? Who were the publishers? What were the games available to us in the 80s? In the era when I was a kid with pocket money rattling around in my pocket, trying to decide what I should spend my £1.99 or £2.99 on, and then rushing home to play it. So you're either going to get very nostalgic with me today looking at cover art that you haven't seen for a very long time, or you're going to get a taste of what was available to us. And I think we should dive straight in with some of the earlier publishers. I can spot one on the top shelf there. Let's have a look. We'd like to thank PCBWay.com for supporting our episode today. They aren't just about PCBs, although they do a tremendous job of that. They also offer CNC machining, sheet metal fabrication, 3D printing and injection moulding. If you're creating, then PCBWay.com can help you bring your project to life. Get an instant quote now over at PCBWay.com, and we thank them for their support. So this game Dungeons was made by Bug-Byte, who were formed in 1980 by Tony Baden and Tony Milner. And they made games for a range of micros. They were based in Liverpool, in the north of England, an area that would become something of a hub for video game developers and publishers in this period. And Bug-Byte's most famous game is not this, it's probably Manic Miner, which I don't have a copy of on the Bug-Byte label, which is outrageous really, I should have one. I have got a copy of it on another label, we'll come to that later. So let's just jump over to the Amstrad CPC and you can see Manic Miner in action. It was a pixel-perfect platformer, based very much on another game called Miner 2049er, and it really shot Matthew Smith to stardom as the rockstar bedroom coder, and he went on to do great things with the follow-up games, but we'll come on to that later. So that's Bug-Byte, and I can't actually see any other Bug-Byte games on the shelves, which is unfortunate, but let's see what else we can find. A great game in the form of Repton, which was published by Superior Software. By the way, that Dungeons has a price tag of £2.99, as does Repton here, although I think this is a later budget release, and this is, as I say, £2.99. Superior Software were founded in 1982 by Richard Hanson and John Dyson, and this company mainly focused on the BBC Micro and its budget sibling, the Acorn Electron. And as you can see on this Repton, it is a dual format BBC/Electron tape. But they did also put out some games for the C64 and the Auric 1. Repton here, probably their most well-known game, sold over 125,000 units. That's a huge number for the size of the market. And other big hits of theirs included Thrust and Exile. All really good games, and they also put out compilations such as the Play It Again Sam range, and we'll come on to compilations later too, because they would become a big part of shopping for games in the 80s. Down low here are Acorn Soft. So Acorn Soft catered to the BBC Micro and the Acorn Electron market. The BBC Micro very popular in schools, so it had a lot of educational titles, but also quite a lot of arcade clones. So a lot of the early games that came to our systems in the UK, as I imagine in other parts of the world, were inspired by arcades. They were very simple rip-offs of arcades, sometimes written in BASIC before the programmers got a grasp of assembly language for their systems. And well, they were just straight rip-offs, and Snapper is one good example of that here. There's actually two versions of this game. If you look on this, the earlier cover, you can see it's very much a Pac-Man clone. And then not long after came this. And you can see on the screenshot that Pac-Man now has a hat and legs, and the ghosts have now turned into some kind of beings with arms and legs. So they obviously flew a little bit too close to the sun in terms of copyright there and had to change it very quickly. Of course, the big one, the huge game from Acorn Soft was Elite. Elite started there on the BBC Micro. 1984 is the date on this box. And it really heralded that huge universe-wide sandbox environment that you could explore. It was a massive departure from the likes of the arcade clones of Snapper into something much more suited to the home and not something trying to take as much money as it could for the arcades. So we've got Acornsoft to thank for Elite. Taking up a chunk of space on the top here is Microdeal. Now you'd be very thankful for Microdeal if you are a Dragon 32 owner, because very few people catered for that system. But we've got a good selection here, although they're mostly arcade knockoffs again. So we've got things like Caterpillar Attack, very much like a millipede or centipede game. Mr. Dig here, Dig Dug ripoff. Cuthbert in Space. So Cuthbert became the mascot for Microdeal. You see him pop up in quite a few places. The King, a Donkey Kong clone. Defense, a Defender clone. Glaxon, a Galaxian clone. It goes on and on. So quite simple games, but at least you had something to play thanks to Microdeal if you were a Dragon 32 owner. And of course, if you were a hardware maker like Sinclair or Amstrad, it was in your interests to stimulate the market. So they had their own labels. Amstrad had Amsoft. Sinclair, well, they just published games as Sinclair. Some of these would have been included with the system, so I distinctly remember the Amsoft pack had Brigitte and Fruit Machine and Roland on the Ropes and games like that, all included with my Amstrad when I got it. Likewise for the Sinclair, some of these would have been included with the system, but you could still buy them in the shops. I don't think there's any that I would really rate as being high quality games, but at least we had something on Christmas morning or on the morning of our birthday to put in the tape deck and play before we rushed down the shop to buy something a bit more premium to enjoy on our systems. But as time went on, two things happened. It became apparent which platforms were the most popular, and so the distribution of games available to us were kind of stretched out like this. The ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64 being the big hitters, they sold a lot. The Amstrad CPC less so, but I had a pretty good selection, helped in part by the fact that the ZX Spectrum was Z80 based, as was the CPC, so a lot of games could get ported between them quite easily. And then up here you had the MISC Micros. So the machines that it was quite apparent weren't doing so well in sales numbers, the Electron, the Dragon 32, the Mattel Aquarius. I don't think I ever saw an Aquarius game on the shelves back in the day. Atari 800, the Oric 1. I think that's all of them up there. There were probably more. So they kind of got bundled into a miscellaneous shelf on the side, if they were indeed sold at all. But it was this chunk that were the popular ones that were catered for the most. The other thing that happened was that publishing companies started to get serious. They moved on from being a single person at home duplicating tapes, perhaps making the art at home, packaging and posting from home. Publishers started to actually rent offices, hire staff, and they realized the potential in this industry and the kind of money that they might be able to make out of it. They didn't necessarily hire programmers in-house, some did, but most of them continued to work freelance, or people would submit their games to the publishing company to see if they might be lucky enough to have them published. So let's see what publishers we can find that reflect the evolution of that industry on the shelves here. Mastertronic, let's start with those, not least because I'm seeing them on every single shelf, covering nearly every single system. They were prolific game publishers. What Mastertronic really excelled at was leading the charge for budget games. Their first games appeared in 1984, and most of them were priced at just £1.99. And that was perfect for our demographic that had spent very little money on a micro, couldn't afford a disk drive, and were considering pirating all of their games with blank cassette tapes. Well, at £1.99, is it even worth the hassle? They also had subcategories on the label. So there's one here, which is Mad Games. So this is still Mastertronic. That stood for Mastertronic Added Dimension. And they sold these games for £2.99. So here's the last V8 for the Commodore 64 with that incredible Rob Hubbard music in the game. £2.99 was still budget, but they considered these to be a bit more premium. In 1987, Mastertronic bought out the Ricochet range. So like a Rebounding Bullet or a Rebounding Smash Hit game, they would re-release games once again at a budget price. So a good example of that is the re-released Ghostbusters as a Ricochet title, which sold nearly 500,000 copies. That one was a huge success for them. Mastertronic also did a range of flippy tapes. So on one side of the tape, on this example, Werewolves of London is the ZX Spectrum version, and on the other side is the Amstrad CPC version. So just one product line for both systems. That was pretty cool. And Mastertronic also had the Bulldog label. Now, this was an attempt to distribute the best of British games over to the US. So remember, C64 was pretty popular here, so why not try and send some C64 games back over in the direction of the US? Whether that was a success or not, I don't know, but Mastertronic all the same. And how would those Mastertronic games have arrived at the shop? Well, this is an odd thing I just happened to have in the storeroom. It's a Mastertronic distribution box that would have been used to get things into the shop. So this would have been stuffed full of tapes with that very familiar, at least to me, Mastertronic logo there on the box, the fastest moving software. It's a fun thing to have for the museum. Another thing, while we're on the topic of Mastertronic, was a new book that came out recently that you might be interested in. This is Mastertronic, the Commodore 64 Collector's Guide to Mastertronic from Fusion Retro Books, written by our good friend Colin Poole, who's one part of the Let's Talk Retro channel, and it just covers every single game ever released by Mastertronic for the C64 with screenshots and a little write-up of every game. I bought this, I backed the Kickstarter, and no doubt if you go to Fusion Retro Books, you'll be able to find it, if not now, then in the near future. And I'm going to put it down now before I start sounding like an advert, but I just wanted to support Colin and that book because it's a fun book. So that's Mastertronic. Mastertronic also marketed the Sega Master System in the UK, which wasn't hugely successful for them, but it did lead to a relationship with Sega. Mastertronic were then acquired by Virgin, who in turn were acquired by Sega. So that Sega relationship continued, and that acquisition happened in 1991. And another big name that you will be recognized internationally is Codemasters. And we've got a lot of Codemasters games here. In fact, I don't need to show you the Codemasters games here because we've got a complete collection, the whole set of Codemasters games here in this plan drawer. These are very kindly loaned to us by Gary Pinkett. Thank you, Gary. Every single Codemasters game released for the ZX Spectrum. Codemasters were a little bit later to the party. They came along in 1986 and were founded by young brothers Richard and David Darling, who were coding their own games and decided to set up a publisher for them too. They also hired the talents of other coders for the label, coders such as the Oliver twins, who made a series of games based on an egg called Dizzy, which was incredibly popular. Codemasters covered multiple formats, and this drawer is just full of nostalgia for me. I picked many of these off the shelves and bought them back in the day, whether it's from W.H. Smith's, Boots, independent stores, or as we moved through the 80s, I started to buy games from the video rental store, from the corner shop that was just selling newspapers and sweets, and oh hello, there's a whole stand of video games here now. Because they were so easy to hang on a peg, because they didn't take up much space, and because they were pocket money prices, you could buy these things anywhere. And Codemasters, as well as Mastertronic, were very much at the forefront of getting themselves into all of these places and distributing them far and wide. But looking through these drawers, Bmx Simulator, that's a game I played a hell of a lot, often head-to-head with my brother. Grand Prix Simulator, effectively Bmx Simulator, but with cars. And so many more besides. This will be tickling the nostalgia strings of many people here in the UK, and it just gives you an idea of the art style, the types of games that we had available. You'll notice a lot of things that feel off-brand. Cover art that almost looks like an action hero, but not quite. Titles that almost sound like a famous film, but not quite. Because of course, you're not going to pay for a big movie license when you're trying to sell budget software. Or are you? Well, licensing becomes a big deal in the mid-80s onwards because it soon becomes apparent that it's incredibly lucrative to hitch your game onto a well-known brand, a movie, a famous person, a pop band, anything really that's known, trusted and established that you can hitch your game trailer onto might actually increase sales. Whether it's a good game or not, people might buy it anyway. And two of the big companies that took that challenge on were Ocean Software and Elite Systems, who were founded in 1984. And we've got plenty of examples of their games on the shelves too. So here's a big one which Elite Systems got the rights to. It's Commando, a huge seller. It says on this box, Christmas #1, 1985, and it actually says at the bottom, Encore. So this was a later release, much like the Ricochet releases from Mastertronic. They re-released again their most popular hits. So this is Commando re-released by Elite under their Encore label. Also, that applies to Scooby-Doo, so they've licensed the rights to use the Scooby-Doo cartoon. Battleships, they've licensed the rights to the Battleships game. Other games that Elite are well known for licensing include Paperboy, the Atari arcade game, that was a huge hit for them, and the TV show Airwolf, another big hit for them, and not necessarily a very good game. I remember Airwolf being incredibly frustrating, but Elite made the most of that license, and I think they had Ghosts and Goblins as well. So TV shows, arcade games that we were familiar with, Elite really did make a lot of money from them, and they were quite early to the game. And then there was Ocean Software, who spread their licensing wings even further and even wider. We're talking TV shows, we're talking movie licenses. Let's find some of them on the shelves here. They had the rights to an athlete here, Daley Thompson's Decathlon, in this lovely clamshell box. This was effectively a track and field clone, but they used the name of an athlete called Daley Thompson, who was expected to win gold in the 1984 games, which was held in Los Angeles, I believe. And thankfully he did. So being the gold medalist, being the hero of the Olympics for us here in the UK, he went on to sell them a huge amount of this game. It also broke a lot of our joysticks. It was a joystick waggler, you can imagine, track and field style, and that was famous for breaking joysticks. They also took on licenses for pop stars. Frankie Goes to Hollywood. They made a whole game around Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and this bigger box version, which was sold in 1985, it says on the back here, it has 2 cassette tapes. One, an exclusive live version of some of Frankie Goes to Hollywood's music. There you go, a special live recording of Relax, as well as the game. It's actually a pretty good game, surprisingly. They've come up with a really decent game around a pop band. So that's a good one from Ocean, and another example of licensing. Of course, they licensed Batman, which would go on to be sold for the 8-bits, but also later they used the Batman license for the packing title, the Batman pack for the Amiga 500, which sold so many Amigas. But we're getting ahead of ourselves there into the 16-bit era. Let's see what else we've got in the 8-bit era for Ocean. Gryzor, so they've licensed that from Konami, a great arcade game. The Untouchables, so they licensed the movie The Untouchables. Often they would license these things before the movie had come out, of course, and they would have to try and base the game around the script or what little parts of the script they got to see and create a game. So often the game would bear no resemblance to the movie whatsoever. But The Untouchables actually reviewed very well. That was a decent game in a landscape of quite poor movie to game adaptations. They don't have a great reputation, but Untouchables, I guess Batman as well, they do buck that trend. They're pretty decent games. Robocop. I can't believe I nearly forgot Robocop, talking about Ocean and licensing. There's a big poster of him on the wall over here. That was a massive game for Ocean. That sold over 1 million copies, and it was the best-selling video game in the UK in 1989. Of all platforms, that was the biggest seller on cassette tape, Robocop. So that made Ocean a bucket of cash. They would go on to be acquired by Infogrames in the longer term. What else might we have seen in our shop in the 80s? Now, here are 3 games that are standing out for me. 3 games in the same series, Joe Blade 1, 2 and 3. And these were published by Players. Players appeared on our shelves from 1986, and they were another company with a range priced at £1.99. But then they also brought out the Players Premier range, which you can see here on Joe Blade 3. And that was priced at £2.99. And this Joe Blade series was by far their most successful range of games. Now, I picked out Players because that's a name that I remember, and these are games I remember seeing on the shelves, but they were actually part of another publishing house called Interceptor. Now, let's come back to that company Bug-Byte, who we spoke about earlier, who released Manic Miner and had the coder Matthew Smith with him. Well, I keep seeing this, so I've got to talk about it. It's games from software projects. So out of Bug-Byte, well, basically, Bug-Byte didn't secure the rights to Manic Miner. When Matthew Smith left, he took the game with him. So call that naivety in the early days of the industry, or an oversight, I don't know. But when he left, he was free to take Manic Miner with him. And so he took it to a company called Software Projects. And then the follow-up, Jet Set Willy, was published under that label. Software Projects also had the rights to Dragon's Lair. Of course, it was nothing like the Laserdisc original, but that was a big name to license. So software projects exploded, I guess, out of Bug Bite, and then another company did as well, and that company was Imagine. So Matthew Smith moved from Bug Bite to software projects in 1983, and so too did programmer Eugene Evans and some senior staff to set up another new software house named Imagine. Now Imagine were something of a whirlwind. They were spending money faster than they could make it. They had the fast cars in the car park, they had glitzy marketing campaigns. They gave off this image of a rock and roll lifestyle, and well, it just wasn't sustainable. They went bankrupt by 1984, so it didn't last long. Despite having some great games in the early days, it just didn't work out for them, and they only had themselves to blame. The Imagine name was bought though, and its rights to its games to a company called Bo Jolly, who in turn sold these rights to a company called Subvert further down the line, and then the name Imagine was hoovered up by Ocean Software, who we were just talking about. So any releases that used the Imagine name after 1984 were not the original Imagine. Some of its programmers went on to work for Psygnosis, who were in turn bought by Sony in the 90s. Another example of the way the cottage industry of British software houses were condensed over time and hoovered up. Let's move now to games published by US Gold. US Gold, that sounds like it must be an all-American company bringing us exotic American games. Well, no, it was very much a British company. It was established in 1984 by Jeff Brown, and it had one goal in mind. It was to import games from the US and sell them at knockdown prices in the UK. And very successful it was too. It wasn't just the US though. A big success for them was a deal with Capcom to port their arcade games over, the best selling of which would be Bionic Commando. Let's see what other examples we've got here. I've picked out Roadrunner, which was the Atari arcade game. I can also see here Winter Games, which was by Epix originally. So US Gold bought that over for us. There's lots of examples here. There's the arcade game Vigilante, distributed by US Gold. Gauntlet 2, so another one from Atari Games. Forgotten Worlds, that's a Capcom tie-in. So Forgotten Worlds, the shoot 'em up, US Gold on one side, Capcom on the other. Yeah, there's no shortage of US Gold games here, and that would have been the case back in the day as well. And these dual cassette sized games, even if they didn't have dual cassettes in, these were not budget games. These were generally sold at more of a premium. £7.99, £9.99. I remember buying Outrun in a thing like this, which did have 2 cassette tapes. In fact, it had the game for my Amstrad CPC, and it had a second cassette, which was the soundtrack from the arcade. So I would put that in the hi-fi. I'd actually take my dad's hi-fi out of the lounge, put it next to the computer, play the arcade music while I was playing my slightly inferior, shall we say, port of the game. But it, you know, in my imagination, it made it much more like the arcade. So those larger games sold at a premium, but US Gold did also have a budget label, and that was the Kix label. And there are some examples here of Kix games and others dotted around the place. And there's no indication here that they were actually anything to do with US Gold, but I can assure you they were. So that was their way of selling both a premium and a budget product and trying to cover both ends of the market. US Gold would eventually end up being acquired by Eidos. Another software house originating from 1984 that we see on our shelves here was Telecomsoft. Now they published games using the Firebird, Rainbird and Silverbird labels. And the interesting thing about this label is that it was a division of British Telecom, who at the time was our telecoms provider. So a couple of games I've found here on the Firebird label are Savage, which was priced at £8.99, so that was more of a premium game, and Sidewise, which I'm guessing would have been the same price. So those are some more premium ones. Let's see if we can find some budget Firebird, Silverbird or Rainbird games. I wonder if the US had the equivalent. Did AT&T or Marbell, did they have a software arm at any point? Maybe they did. Let me know in the comments if they did. They did pretty well for themselves. They did acquire other software houses, including over here on the pegboards Beyond Software. And even though they were making good money, they did choose to sell the company to Microprose for a reported £2 million in 1989, which was probably a good jumping off point if they didn't want to move into the 16-bit era. If they thought, let's cut our losses here, although, sorry, cut our losses is the wrong turn of phrase because they were making decent money. let's cash in. That's a better term. Let's cash in here in 1989. Then that was a good time to do it without moving into the 16-bit era. Apparently there was also an attempt at a management buyout. So the management did want to buy and continue running Telecom Soft, but they decided, no, let's sell it to Microprose. So that's what they did. So this is a successful publisher. This is Alternative Software. They appeared in 1985. And by 1988, they had a slightly higher market share than Mastertronic. So they were really motoring. And by 1990, founder Roger Hulley claimed that the company had a 17% share of the budget game sector. So I can't prove that claim myself, but if true, that's a pretty big chunk of the market. School Days was a big hit for them, a very British game about going to school. And in 1989, they too went down the licensing route, but they specifically tried to target children's TV shows. So Count Duckula, The Wombles, The Sooty Show, things like that they licensed. I think Postman Pat as well might have come from Alternative Software. So they licensed all of these and they were doing pretty well and they continued to do so. And right up into the present day, you can still find games from Alternative in Steam. I think in 2017 it was that they remastered School Days. So you could buy that on your iOS or your Android device. I haven't played it myself on a modern device, but I might give it a go. It sounds quite interesting. And one of the few original British publishers that continue to be active today, or at least in more recent years. There's not a huge amount of activity on Steam at the moment, but I assume they're still going. So many more to get through. Let's pick a few more that stand out, including games by Hewson Software. This is Ranarama. By the way, this isn't meant to be a complete overview of British software houses or the history of British software houses. We are literally picking things off of shelves, talking about them and just getting a feel for what would have been in the shops in the 80s. So that's all we're doing. I will miss things and I am relying on you guys in the comments to tell me what we need to add to the shop to have a more complete picture of the 80s. But Hewson is a really important one. I always associate Hewson with very good quality games. They really knew what they were doing and they put out good premium quality games. Hewson was founded by Andrew Hewson. They put out their first game all the way back in 1981 on the ZX81. I think that was a game called Space Intruders. But it's games like this, Ranarama, Uridium, Nebulous and Eliminator that really stand out for me from my own personal memories of 8-bit gaming. Some more examples I found here include Marauder. There's another one called Gunrunner and Nebulous. Just a few of the many titles that they published. And again, these are on double-sized cassettes. So these would have been full-price games, if you like. But we would have seen budget releases at later dates. You know, they would have released and re-released these games to make as much as possible out of them. And when Hewson were done with their own label, they formed 21st Century Entertainment. That's the company that put out Pinball Dreams, Pinball Fantasies, Pinball Illusions. So the bar for quality remained consistently high into the 16-bit era with those games. And Hewson is also still very active. Andrew Hewson and his son go to retro expos, talk about the old days, tell us about how they did it. And if you go onto Twitter and follow @HewsonJoystick is the username, you can chat to them there and you can see what they're up to and what expos they're going to and all the rest of it. So still very active and yeah, a mark of quality was a Hewson game. That's what I always thought, although I couldn't always afford them because my pocket money normally only stretched to the Codemasters and the Mastertronics, and then I had to wait for the Hewson games to fall into a budget range before I could get my hands on them. Next on the shelf, the Gremlin logo. It's very distinctive, you can't miss it, and it's a logo that gives me a warm, fuzzy feeling, whether it's on a game like Jack the Nipper or the very striking art of Avenger. Founded in 1984, there's that year again, 84, when software houses are really exploding into life in the UK. The company grew out of a software store called Just Micro in Sheffield, up in the north. And here's another bit of software house crossover. Jeff Brown of US Gold, who we've talked about, owns 75% of the company Gremlin, with Ian Stewart and Kevin Norburn, who has established it. Games on the Gremlin label include Alfreda St. Monty. So Monty Mole was something of a mascot who had multiple games, and it was a very successful series. They've got the license to Mickey Mouse at some point. So we've got Walt Disney's Mickey Mouse the computer game. Crackout was a Breakout clone. There are others dotted around here. An Avenger in the lovely clamshell box. I do love a clamshell box for a game. Gremlin would power on into the 16-bit era, publishing games like Supercars or Supercars 2 here on the Amiga, which is a game I'm very fond of, a top-down racer. They would be very successful and they would acquire other companies. They picked up DMA Design along the way, so that went into the Gremlin umbrella, DMA Design of Lemmings and Grand Theft Auto fame. But ultimately, they, like so many others, were hoovered up by Infogrames. That's where Gremlin ended up. No tour of 8-bit British games can be complete without talking about the Stamper Brothers, of course, and their games on the Ultimate Play the Game label. Now this was a label that was a mark of quality. Whether it was Alienate, Nightshade, Staff of Carnoth, Nightlaw, Jetpack, which needed only 16K on a ZX Spectrum, the original ZX Spectrum configuration before 48K came as standard, Trans Am. They made systems do things that they shouldn't have been capable of. And in a way, in the example of Jetpack, for example, that could have been put in an arcade machine easily, and that would have taken money all day in the year that it came out. That was a superb game. Set up in 1982, the Ultimate games were certainly a mark of quality, at least while the Stamper Brothers were running it, because by 1985, it was rumoured that they were going to sell Ultimate to Ocean. But it turns out they didn't. They struck up a better deal. I presume it's a better deal that was going on behind the scenes, but they struck up a deal. Instead of Ocean, they went to US Gold. But not before they'd set up another company on the side, which wasn't included in the acquisition, and that company was called Rare Limited. So Ultimate, the Stamper Brothers became Rare. They then went on to make games for the NES, games like Solar Jetman, and then Donkey Kong Country for the Super Nintendo. Of course, GoldenEye 007 for the N64, and so many other games besides. So they went on to do huge things, while US Gold kept using the Ultimate name for their budget re-releases, and they did release a couple more games, but they were never quite up to the same standard as when the brothers were involved in it. So you cannot have a conversation about British micro games without including Ultimate. These were a class act. And it's a rare example of a British company from the 8-bit days really smashing through the ceiling, because they were bought by Microsoft in 2002 for a cool $377 million. I think perhaps only Codemasters comes close to that in the financial success that they made in the longer term. So they did pretty well for themselves, and you've seen some examples of British publishers, British developers, but of course we had things that would have been familiar to you further afield, publishers that you would have heard of as well. So let's just skim through some of those. We will have seen games in our shops from the likes of Domark, from the likes of Accolade and Activision, from the likes of Microprose even. Generally, if it was popular on your side of the pond in the US, it would have made its way over here somehow, either published on one of our own homegrown labels, or as the market grew, the US and the Japanese would have got wind of it being a lucrative market and bought their own labels over here to sell things, and so grew the software industry. And despite this wall of cassette tapes, yes, we had discs as well. We had the 5 1/4 inch floppies, albeit in a smaller selection. So for example, we've got Bruce Lee, published by US Gold. We've got from Epix, Summer Games and Winter Games, Beachhead again from US Gold. So some examples of 5 1/4 inch disc games for the C64, and the likes of Amstrad and Sinclair did try to push from cassette tape into discs, the 3-inch floppy disk. And I haven't got many games at all on 3-inch floppy disk, I have to be honest, because it wasn't really that successful. It was built into the Sinclair ZX Spectrum Plus 3 when that came out, and also into the Amstrad CPC 6128. Now by this point Amstrad had bought Sinclair, so it was also something to do with Alan Sugar of Amstrad trying to monopolise the 3-inch disc format for himself, and it didn't really catch on because everyone was so happy with the low cost of cassette tapes. And the final thing we can't leave without talking about in our shop is compilations. Compilations were a big thing. If you had a little bit of money burning a hole in your pocket, you had a bit more than a budget title, maybe you had enough for a £9.99 game. If you were happy with some games that were a little bit older, then you might go for a £10 compilation, something like these examples. And they did represent pretty good value for money, some of these. But not only that, I just find some of the boxes the most evocative in the shop here, because often they were out of my budget. So I would kind of lust after these boxes. These were on the shelves of things that I couldn't afford. So there's an element of that makes me like them so much. And at the other end of the scale, you've got these ridiculous, like this Bojolly pack here, which has 30 games in one box. And there's a price on the back from Microland, £16.99 for 30 games. Some of them from Hewson, from Palace Software, quite a few from Hewson, in fact. Nearly all from Hewson. They've done well there. Thalamus, another software house we haven't talked about. So 30 games in a compilation. I mean, that's pretty extreme. Codemasters with their Dizzy collection. And Ocean here, who have partnered with High Street Store Dixon's. I remember this compilation in the metal bargain bins that they had dotted around the store. That's got things like Head Over Heels, Batman, Slap Fight, and The Legend of Cage in there. Spectrum plus 10 hits, 10 Spectrum plus 2 hits. So things like that really bring back a lot of great memories for me. So from the low cost $1.99 budget titles to the slightly more premium games to the not big box but bigger box, cardboard box, not plastic box games. We had plenty of those. Then we did have some bigger box games on the bottom shelf here. So we weren't without our big box games in the 80s. Floppy disk games in the form of 5 1/4 and 3-inch games. If you walked into a video game shop in the 80s in the UK, this is what you would have been faced with. So there we go. It's certainly not a comprehensive history of British publishers, but it's a really good snapshot because you have to remember all of this stock here has come from donations to the cave. It's turned up with systems that people owned. These are the games that people had with their systems back in the day because they've turned up here with the systems. So these are the more popular titles, the more popular publishers of the day that we would have seen. And a few rare ones dotted in there as well. What do you think? What have I missed? Who are the big software houses that I've missed out on and I need to get on my shelves? Do I need to build more shelves? Do I need more space for cassettes? I think I probably do. But I'm interested in your comments and I'm interested in hearing how this selection, this range, these publishers and these games compared to what you had available to you in whatever part of the world you're from. I'm sure some of this brown and beige slat wall rings true with the kind of shops you had, but what was on the shelves might have been entirely different or it might have been similar. Leave some comments below, let me know your stories, and I'd love to chat with you guys about what it was like in your part of the world. As always, thank you for taking the time to watch. Take care. Don't forget you can come and visit this yourself. Head over to rmcretro.com/visit if you're interested in doing that, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's episode. If you enjoyed it and like what I do on the channel, join the official Cave Dwellers over at patreon.com/RMC Retro.